Hello, welcome to Graphic Policy Radio. This is a comics podcast, and this is your host, Ilana Levin. This is the comics podcast for the sort of folks who know that not only are comics political, they are a long-standing form of mass political communications and a really unique way to speak directly to an audience. And today we have some guests who are working on a really exciting new comic series. What if the attack on the U.S. Capitol succeeded? A tale of what was, what could have been, and what still could be. 1/6, the graphic novel, is our topic today, and we are joined by two of the writers who made this book possible. It's written by Jenkins and Golan and illustrated by Will Rosado. 1/6 asks and answers the question, what if the January 6, 2021 insurrection had been successful? The graphic novel chillingly illustrates how close we came to authoritarian rule in America and the threats to our democracy we still face. And to tradition of speculative fiction like 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale and The Twilight Zone, it explores themes of autocracy, scapegoating, strategic disinformation, and more, all through a compelling character-driven story. Drawing on real-life events, 1/6 travels the road that led from backroom meetings, white supremacist rallies, and the Four Seasons landscaping parking lot to a violent attack on the Capitol that left several Americans dead and shook our nation to its core. It imagines a world in which the events of that day had turned out differently. So joining me, we have Jenkins. He is a writer, Harvard Law School professor, and human rights advocate. He teaches courses on racial justice, strategic communications, and Supreme Court jurisprudence, and is a frequent commentator in broadcast and print media. He's also been on our podcast in the past to talk about Black Panther. Jenkins' previous positions include president and co-founder of the social justice communication lab, The Opportunity Agenda, director of human rights at the Ford Foundation, assistant to the Solicitor General at the U.S. Department of Justice, and assistant counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He is a member of the board of the Brooklyn Museum in New York City, where I just was, and a faculty advisor to the Carr Center for Human Rights. Welcome back to the show, Alan.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back.
You know, I knew you would be working on a comic from our conference, from when you were on the show. I know you guys had actually done a comic as the Opportunity Agenda, but I could tell there was that desire in you to come up with more. And so it's really even exciting to see this come to pass.
Thank you. Anyone who's known me since I was 15 years old has predicted that I would eventually do a comic book. So it's great to actually make it happen.
And let me tell you, I was so relieved that it was really good. You know, I feel like from the standpoint of the political activism significance of this book, I might have been like tempted to cover it anyway, but like added bonus, guys, it's really good. Also joining us is Golan. He is the co-writer of 1/6. He is an activist, illustrator, and New York Times bestselling author who has been working for more than 3 decades as a grassroots organizer within social justice movements for racial and economic justice. He is co-author of the best-selling children's book parodies Goodnight Bush and Goodnight Trump, and the critically acclaimed graphic novel The Adventures of Unemployed Man, which played a role in the Occupy Wall Street movement. He is a lead designer of the People's Climate March, one of the largest climate mobilizations in history. I was there. There are photos. More recently, he is the co-founder of The Climate Clock, a global art project that counts down the critical time window remaining for humanity to enact systemic solutions to climate change. Welcome to the show, Gon.
So great to be here and very excited to be on the show finally. I'm a big fan of your work and the show.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I knew we'd have to get it together. We have mutual former podcast guest, although only recently, Charles Lenchner, I think, introduced us a very long time ago, and I knew this would have to happen someday. So tell us, guys, what was the genesis of this project?
Well, I can start. This is Alan. In the days and weeks after the insurrection, January 6, 2021, I found myself waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, literally, worrying about our democracy and worrying about the fact that the narrative in the country already seemed to be, you know what, we dodged a bullet, it's all over, time to go back to business as usual. And, for me and for so many of us who are paying attention, it's not over. The threats still remain. Anti-Semitism, which was very much on display on January 6th, are on the rise. Disinformation is on the rise. Book burning, of all things that we would have to talk about in 2023, on the rise. And so, and a lot of the election deniers are still very much in place and in office. And so I started to think about what could be done to tell that story, to connect people to the threats that still remain and to ways to take action. And immediately I thought of a graphic novel or a series of comic books as the right vehicle to do that. And then immediately after that, I thought of Golan as the person I would most want to collaborate in doing it. Somebody who I know is both as a cultural strategist is brilliant and also is extremely talented, creative. And so the idea was born.
That's awesome. Gon, when you got, when Alan reached out to you, what were your thoughts about embarking on this project?
Well, I was already deeply embroiled in social justice work regarding other crises, working on climate issues and working on trying to stop Trump from building a border wall in my wife's hometown. So when Alan came to me with this idea, I thought, what's one more crisis to deal with, No, but he sold me immediately. It was such, the premise of it, this idea of this alternate history in which the insurrection, the attempted coup succeeded, would give us such a window into the big vision, the grand plans of this, very strongly emerging, right-wing extremist, white supremacist, Christian nationalist, call it what you like, neo-Confederate movement in the United States that we need to be taking a lot more seriously. So it had it all. It was something very important to be talked about, but also just a really brilliant twist and way to creatively start to talk about this huge issue.
And I know this came together really quickly. I remember, Gon, we spoke when you were looking for an artist earlier on, and I'm really excited you got to work with Will Rosado. His art looks fabulous for this. How did you guys connect?
Well, we put the feelers out there to lots of folks, and Will is a veteran. He's been in this game for a long time, and he immediately got it. It was very interesting, actually, to talk to a number of artists and people who were completely in agreement with the issue, but some had some real fear about participating in this project, which was really fascinating because it just shows the level of real vulnerability that people are feeling right now, and these threats that we saw of violence that we've seen throughout the country, or more than threats, which manifested on January 6th itself. It has really had a chilling effect on a lot of people wanting to put themselves out there. Will had no reservations and was like, yeah, I'm totally game. I totally understand this idea. And he has added a lot through his art to the storytelling. And so he's just been a great, part of our team. And he worked on G.I. Joe and other sort of classic Marvel DC titles. But he most recently worked on La Boriqueña, which is sort of a Puerto Rican superhero that rises up in the wake of the hurricane. And so, he's been right there with us, and we've been having a lot of fun working with him.
That's so cool. I'm from the DC area originally, and I was really excited to know confirmation that the resistance is going to be based out of Ben's Chili Bowl. The specificity of that was like, yes, this is good. For those who don't know, that is a DC landmark, like long-standing.
Yeah.
I don't even know how long the place has been open, since long before anybody on this podcast was born, establishment.
Yeah, they've been around since the late 1950s and are still going. And it's interesting that, people who've spent time in DC immediately peg it, even though we don't actually name a place where the resistance is. And everybody else just thinks it's a fun connection to chili. So I'm glad you caught it.
Oh, absolutely. No, the comic has a really good sense of place, and that everything is just really freaking well done. I'm so glad to see it looking like this. And folks, this is available. How are you distributing it right now? It's online. But what's the main distribution way for folks to get a hold of it?
Yeah, so the digital version is available on Amazon and also on Issuu, ISSUU, which is a digital platform. And so we're talking, I guess, third week in February. In a couple of weeks, the print version will be available, hopefully everywhere. It'll definitely be on Amazon.
Nice.
We'll be in comic book stores. And we're actually, because we got some support from a couple of foundations, we're going to make free copies available to pro-democracy and anti-discrimination organizations to use in their organizing, in educational efforts, and, just to help get the word to people who might not otherwise find it accessible.
Yeah. So what really are the goals of this project, and why do it as a comic book?
Well, there has been a lot of reporting around January 6th. There was an 850-page report from the January 6th committee, but that is only going to reach a certain amount of people. And we felt that a graphic novel is actually a way to bring these very important issues to a much broader audience, and in a way that's much more accessible and clear. And at the same time, we could tell parts of the story that a journalist couldn't, or an academic couldn't, or it couldn't be said in the January 6th committee hearing report. And that is the speculative side of this story, which is really important because, we were very close to things going a different way on January 6th, which would have put us in a remarkably different reality, living in a very different country. And those threats, those dangers actually still remain. And so we need to remain vigilant. We need to really continue to keep these in mind. And this speculative fiction, sci-fi kind of approach to the story allows us to get into that, which is what we saw on January 6th was really just the tip of the iceberg of a much bigger vision for the transformation of American society. And so we wanted to tell that part of the story through this alternate reality timeline as well. And so that's the bigger picture that I think we have the flexibility to tell a story about in a graphic novel form that you just wouldn't have in these other medium. But the cool part of what we're doing is that we want to make sure that the factual parts of our story are very clear. And Alan could speak more to this, but we have a really grounded part of the story, and that'll be apparent in issue number 2, which is forthcoming, in the known provable facts about January 6th. And that will be clearly distinguished in the storytelling from the speculative pieces. So people will know the difference between the factual part and the speculative part, and that the factual part is incredibly well researched and backed up throughout the story.
Awesome. Yeah. When you're putting together a story that is speculative about something that came so close to happening and also is just so close in time, we can imagine so many different things, but it has to pass a sort of sniff test, because we were all here, we remember. How do you kind of spill out a speculation from something we were here for, right?
One of the things we had the privilege to do is reach out to a lot of people who were experts of various kinds on the insurrection and in its many dimensions. And I'll say in a minute what I mean by that. So we talked to political reporters. We talked to some people who were there on January 6th, reporting on the Capitol. We spoke to people who were experts about disinformation, about Christian nationalism, about white supremacy. And we asked them, what are you most afraid of? What could have happened? And perhaps more importantly, what are you afraid might come back? How would the world have been different? Or how would the world be different if some of these forces were in control? And it was really chilling. There's some stuff that was almost too chilling to include in a graphic novel form. But we tried to mostly go there. When former President Trump, in the real world, called certain media outlets enemies of the people. What does that mean? Let's play that out. What consequences could that have had, and what consequences could it have? When people were calling for suspending the Constitution or for declaring martial law, these are all real things that people with significant power and influence were calling for. ahead of, and in some instances during January 6th. And so we took those things. We, kind of looked at the full list. We couldn't, it's got to be a dramatic and efficient story, so we couldn't use them all. But Gon and I then spent many, many hours in a closed room, walking through how these things might play out and how they could be told in a dramatic, interesting, engaging form. And we're still doing it. So, as Gon mentioned, chapter 2, the second issue is grounded significantly in real events as well as some fictional ones. And we'll be clear about which is which. But, there's new stuff coming out now from the Dominion voting machine litigation, for example. We're learning new things that were happening at Fox News. And I have, as Gon mentioned, we've really fact-checked all of the true things. And so I have two fantastic research assistants, Emily and Jennifer, who are constantly bringing new stuff to me and saying, hey, this should really be included. So it's been an interesting blending of a creative process, a generative process, and also kind of a research and academic process.
What was something, it's an interesting question also about like making decisions about what you actually maybe don't want to run because it's maybe too much inspiration perhaps for people to do like counterintelligence work, like to have to think about those sorts of questions.
Yeah, one other thing I'll add, and Gon may have more to say about this. We do not want to give anyone any ideas.
Yeah.
So, everything we've depicted and that we're going to depict in future issues is rooted in something that has already been said or done. And we're just taking it to its logical and in some cases extreme, endpoint. But we're not trying to plant any seeds. And that happens in pop culture where the character that you think is the villain actually becomes the hero for, people who have a different perspective. So we've tried to be pretty clear about that. And then, there's some things that we want this to be available to younger folks, to a range of audiences. And so, there's some things that, and this is part of the power of comic books, you can allude to without having to show. And sometimes it's more chilling, but less graphic, if you will, by doing it that way.
Totally. So how did you guys design your core cast and the particular point of view characters who the story is told through?
Yeah, well, we wanted to really show how the events of January 6th impact real people. This isn't just an abstract political issue about democracy. This is about how it affects our daily lives, whether we're political and consider ourselves activists or whether we're not. And we created 4 fictional characters. They are all based on a lot of research that we've done on real individuals or groups of people, but people who represent the breadth of the political spectrum in the United States. So not all of our characters are liberal. There's a MAGA Trump supporter, and we try to treat them all with a great deal of humanity to understand their motivations, whether they're doing something right or wrong. How do people find themselves in these situations, and how are their lives transformed on January 6th? All of our characters are really, their lives are thrown upside down by the events of that day. And that's both what defines their future, but also what brings them together. And that they are also a metaphor for, the transformation of the country that would happen if the coup had been successful. But we really wanted to bring a lot of diversity to that story. So we have a journalist, independent journalist working in Washington, D.C., who is about to break an important story on the election. We have I don't want to give away too much, but some of this will be revealed. But someone who's a former congressional staffer. We have a MAGA supporter who is very close to his son, who gets brought into the militia movement. And then we have a first responder who's in DC, married to a Capitol police officer. And they're all meant to just bring up different ways in which January 6th would radically change our lives, and show the costs, and then how people adapt and to this new reality. And we start to paint a picture of, where do you find hope? Where do you find solidarity? Where do you find resistance? And that will start to come out as the story emerges. But how these very unlikely group of people actually find a great deal of connection.
Yeah, different points of view are really interesting ones to tell that story as well. And I really like where I think the stem of this work is heading, and the very much like the technology is like our technology, but just a little bit put towards a more totalitarian use of what we already have.
Absolutely. That's, I think, a really important point. We're not trying to create some unimaginable reality when the unimaginable has already happened. On January 6th, we never thought we would see that actually transpire. And there it happened right in front of all of us. And then as we sort of follow what could happen, we're not really inventing anything new. And we're not throwing in, robots, time travel, aliens, anything like that. We're really just saying that, what we have currently in our world today could be put towards terrible use if it ends up in the wrong hands, or, our government is taken over by, a set of players who are very opposed to core American values. And, so there's not, it's not a wild, fantasy story. It's actually very, plausible and believable. And I think that's what makes it so terrifying. We're not trying to create a dystopian story that takes you out of reality. It's meant really to reflect back the reality that we already took one step towards.
The thing is, I'm someone who I don't watch The Handmaid's Tale. I'm not watching The Last of Us. I famously love zombie media to the point where I used to throw an annual party called Easter Zombie. But since COVID, I don't watch zombie media. There's all kinds of dystopian things that I just do not partake in right now because things are too terrible. And I was surprised to find that I actually I wasn't triggered by this. Do you know what I mean? But like you, I agree. This is completely possible to happen this time around. I mean, we see what's happening. Ron DeSantis is full on fascist. Nikki Haley is they're all just like this, but I was sort of surprised that I was actually able to be excited and into it. And it wasn't too scary, even though it is really scary. I don't know. Maybe it's some of the places that you're going or things that I've thought about. I'm not sure. But I would say, if you're listening to this, listeners, me as someone who's really delicate around certain things right now, I was still able to read this. And I found it exciting. You know what? Here's what it was. It's so much from the standpoint of people who are about to do something about it.
Yeah.
That I think that's what makes it something that you can read and enjoy.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear you say that. And, as I noted, that's why, that's what triggered me to contact Gon and work on this project, was because I was feeling helpless and worried at the same time. And so, we intentionally have created characters in a scenario where people are trying to solve the problem. They're trying to address the challenges to our democracy, and to the idea that we all have equal dignity. And we don't know if they're going to succeed or not. We certainly don't know in the first issue. But it's not about just things happening to characters who we care about. It's about, characters who are definitely struggling with trauma and, very challenging circumstances. And all of them are doing something about it. And what we'll see over the course of the issues is them coming together to both fight about what to do and to occasionally do it together. That, I hope, is what both makes it entertaining and also makes it hopeful in a way that would be, perhaps hard to read if it were, headed in the other direction.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I don't know, folks listening to the show, you've probably been like, wow, the show is not coming out as much as it was at one point. I'll tell you, I got COVID in December. I'm still struggling. And, dealing with this in a context in which the president is claiming that the ongoing global pandemic is over, is very disheartening. But, just the other week, I testified on Zoom, city council hearing about the need to maintain masks in medical settings and on transit and to keep PCR testing available. Like my COVID was only positive on a PCR test. It never turned positive on a home rapid test. They're not as accurate. And having done that, I felt so much better afterwards. It was such a good and empowering experience. And, I'm an organizer. Like when crisis happens, I go and I do things about it because that's how I process it. And I guess, there's a big piece of that that's also self-care, but like, I think that, like seeing people do something about it, making people feel like they can do something about it and bringing some agency is important to keeping you like from despairing. It really is the antidote. Yeah.
Yeah. And, something important to add here is that we're working with the Western States Center to create an education and action guide that will go along with the series and be completely free and online available to everyone, that allows people who read the book or who don't read the book to go deeper on the facts, the real facts, and understand what actually happened. And, for instance, what threats remain to journalism or to free speech or democracy, and then recommended action. So we're not going to, prescribe exactly what readers should do, but we want to connect them to the ability to do something regarding the three, themes in the narrative: democracy, discrimination, and disinformation. And that's really important. It's an important part of this work. We didn't want to make the comic book a lecture because that would have been deadly and none of us would have wanted to read it ourselves. But we wanted to make sure that people who wanted to take additional steps could do that. And so the guide will connect them to organizations, but also give them ideas about what they could do on their own. And that's a critical part of this. And Western State Center has been a really great partner in moving that forward.
That's so cool. I love a toolkit. It was good to see that coming out with it. I think, giving people action steps and partnering with an institution is, Alan, we all three of us have been in nonprofit land forever. Can I just say how amazing it is that this is the kind of thing that I'm not saying that you didn't take some pitching, but like that there are nonprofits who are open to understanding why this is valuable work now. It's not just, we want to do this cultural piece and the nonprofits are like, that must be a nice hobby. Bye. It's really shifted.
Yeah. Like both of you, I've been part of the nonprofit industrial complex for a long time. I'm just, newly sprung, in the last couple of years, in academia. But I have to say, and I've said this to Gon, I have never gotten so many yeses so quickly from potential partners, from potential funders. We did a Kickstarter, and exceeded, ultimately our, goals. And so I think the idea is the right one. I think the timing is right. And, I think we're a good team, but I have no illusions that without Gon, who has a track record of successful graphic novels, this would not have, there would have been real questions about execution. But I've been very pleased about the support and collaboration that we've gotten.
That's true. Like making a comic is a new form, is a different form of writing from anything else. Was there anything that surprised you in the process as you guys were working on this together?
I think we're continually surprised in that, graphic novels are a very specific and unique way of storytelling. They have a lot in common with film, being a visual medium. But, you have to think differently to create a compelling story. It is a story that's told page by page. The way that time unfolds in comics is so different than it unfolds in prose or in film. And we were just talking about this today, how much you sort of have to do in film. You shoot all your footage and then you edit it at the end. In comics, you sort of have to do your editing all up front before you commit to sort of shooting your scenes or actually drawing out the comic and storyboards. And so, it's very unique, and you need to understand where its power lies and how to bring, have that serve the story. But that's sort of the beauty of it. I mean, we couldn't have gone out and made this as a film, but we can produce a graphic novel, and it's still one of those few medium where you can tell an epic story that is within reach of a very small team of creators. And sometimes, it's a single person who creates an entire graphic novel start to finish. So I just think, it's a way to sort of punch way above your weight. If you have a good story to tell, and become part of those conversations that, you wouldn't normally have access to now that you have this thing to leverage. And we saw that with the release of our first issue. We got some really great press. And that would have been, if we tried to make the film, that would be happening 2 years from now, after maybe the story is as relevant as it is now. If we had tried to just write another news article, it would have gotten lost in the mix. And so this was a really great strategic intervention to launch this conversation, or keep this conversation about January 6th going, using a graphic novel, which no one else had done at this scale around this subject. So it has a real power. And I think the more creators take advantage of that to tell serious stories that are timely and are relevant to what's happening right now, I think we'll have, more exciting stories to read about. But also it's a way for activists and social movement organizers to really move the conversation and bring people in, recruit people, drive people towards forms of action they can take out in the world. I think there could be a lot more really great, timely social movement graphic novels out there.
Totally. I also was thinking about, you had brought on Will Rosado. Like, it's interesting, like with his work on G.I. Joe, for example, the way that felt relevant to this is very interesting. Because, I was a kid watching the G.I. Joe cartoon in the 80s. I have not read much in the way of the contemporary comics. And I know that the politics around those are actually more complicated and nuanced because it's being written by folks who have the freedom to do so often. But, it's interesting thinking about that, like, contrast from this story that was initially created specifically to be pro-military propaganda, but also had like really good diversity. It was the army of the future, but it was still the fucking army.
Yeah. Well, let's just say Will's skills have definitely come in handy, because when we just say, militia guy storms, office, then all the details are there. He knows how to draw.
Yeah.
all the things that come with, with that type of character. And so, there's a, this sort of dystopian authoritarian element in the story, that uses technology, that uses military gear and all that stuff. And, that was, a breeze for him. So he's actually used a lot of that background, I think, to enrich the story that we're telling.
As you guys were doing the actual news research, like, what is something that you learned that was just really surprising as people who all followed the news already, as our majority of people listening to this have followed the news already? What was something that you'd uncovered in that research that just really caught you off guard, good or bad?
Well, yeah, an early conversation we had was with a reporter who has been covering the grand jury investigation in Georgia that has just wound up. And, he said to us, look, the big story here is not about the attack on the physical attack on the Capitol. He said, that was a last ditch thrown together effort when everything else failed. But you guys need to take a look at the fake elector scheme, at the strong arming of, election officials, at the threats, the attacks, the planned kidnapping of Governor Whitmer in Michigan, and the forming of other capitals. And he said that that's the real plan. And when all of that failed, then they tried direct violence on the Capitol, and that was chilling and really useful because it caused us to, at least in my case, caused me to step back and remember, the juiciest part of this from a storytelling standpoint is the people who stormed the Capitol and, with carrying Confederate flags and, putting their feet up on Nancy Pelosi's desk. But actually, this was much more broad, much more insidious. And one of the challenges for us has been to find interesting ways to depict those other quieter attempts at a coup.
Yeah. One thing that I've expressed frustration with, and I was glad to see that there are a few leftist thinkers who picked up on this also and have written about it, but I felt like for a lot of us on the left, people felt like they weren't allowed to acknowledge that this was bad just because we were also critical of Biden or something. And I'm like, no, that was terrifying. I don't know. I just sometimes worry that people just sort of fall into this false equivalence that as much as things are very bad, that they could have been so much worse. As much as we are also kind of the only people who are pointing out about white supremacists taking over Portland, for example. Like there's stuff that's happened at the lower level where the left has been the only people who've been doing anything or speaking about it. But I feel like we've kind of sometimes lost the sense of urgency or something, I don't know, around what happened at the federal level. Maybe it doesn't matter though, because it is the states. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I was going to say it is complicated, I think, for progressives for a bunch of reasons. One is, you kind of want just like a little drop of closure, after 4 years of the Trump administration. And so, again, that, dodged a bullet kind of idea is an easy one. It's also to fall into. It's also the case, as you note, that many of us are critical of the Biden administration for a bunch of reasons. And so it can feel backward looking to worry about the implications of January 6th, although for all the reasons we've discussed, it's not. It's also the case, and we're going to be taking this up in future issues of 1/6. Most of us don't believe that the status quo of our democracy was that great before.
Right.
And so, not all of us want to fight to, preserve or protect or restore things exactly as they were on January 5th, 2021, or even, 2016. And that's something that our characters take up. Some of them are institutionalists and are like, we just got to restore the democracy. Of course, this is in a world where the insurrection has succeeded. And some of them, are like, hell no, we need to build something better. So just as the people who founded the United States, Hamilton and Washington and, Jefferson, that crowd, were fighting, arguing with each other, both about how do we beat the British and what kind of country should we build instead. Our characters are going to be fighting about that amongst each other, even as they are strategizing together to restore some new vision of democracy. I think those are all legitimate conversations to have, and I'm hoping that the graphic novel will help to spur and to some extent legitimate some of that back and forth.
That's really great to hear.
And I would add to that, I think a lot of us have felt disappointed on some level at the response to January 6th, in the sense that there's been a real vacuum of what's an alternative vision here. What is the thing that we are fighting for, as Alan mentioned? Like, it's not just about stopping this insurrection or holding those who were responsible accountable. It's about, a real recognition that our institutions have increasingly failed to reflect the common good, to create a common vision that we all feel we are working towards as a country. And that vision has been voiced very clearly by social movements of the last decade. We saw that in Occupy Wall Street, talking about income inequality. We've seen that with Black Lives Matter, talking about racial inequality, and so many other movements that have also, I think, really mobilized over the last few years. And we haven't seen that same level of visionary thinking reflected in many parts of our political system. And, the best antidote towards, some horrible dystopian vision is something that gives people hope that we feel we can all be a part of and is worth fighting for. And I think that has been absent from the national conversation and the Biden administration. And so has been, I think, a lack of energy. It's just not, as Alan said, defending the status quo. It's about building something new. And it really is something that we can't abdicate our own responsibility for creating. If political leaders are not willing to offer that, and, right-wing fascists are very motivated around their vision, we need to be out there and actively constructing and fighting for the vision of the world that we believe not just we want to live in, but is healthier for human beings and the planet. And that's, a role that the left has traditionally played. And I think it's something that we're being called upon again to do. And that is really going to be the best antidote towards this growing fascist movement in the United States.
It's true, because it just seems like the Democrat establishment is unaware how they it's like they almost killed you. You know this, right? And yet they're like, we're going to have a bipartisan bill. It's like they just tried to kill you. They just tried to kill you. Why do you think this is going to happen any differently now?
Yeah, something that makes me think of is as I was just teaching this in my classroom a couple of weeks ago. After the Civil War, at the end of the Civil War, President Lincoln, and then especially President Johnson, Andrew Johnson, after President Lincoln was assassinated, they wanted to go back to business as usual. All's forgiven, come back into the Union. Slavery's over, but we don't really care how Black people get treated for the most part. And it was a set of radical Republicans. The Republicans at that time were the party of abolition and greater freedom, who said, hell no, and crafted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to our Constitution, and engineered the Reconstruction effort that brought the first Black men into Congress and allowed lots and lots of Black men to vote. And the federal government was protecting their rights. And then, as a country, we got tired of that, and Reconstruction ended. And that's when we were plunged into almost 100 years of Jim Crow discrimination and lynching and the like. And so, that same, conversation is relevant now. Is all to be forgiven, and, reunion is more important than Reconstruction and realization of our democracy, or are we going to fight for it? In the political realm. And so, we're hoping a few more people will choose the latter as a result of engaging with this book.
Even if the U.S. had actually finished fighting the Civil War and actually committed to Reconstruction, we wouldn't still be having the Reconstruction now, which is still what's happening now, No,
that's it's right. Just... And we saw that. We saw who was occupying the Capitol and what symbols they were carrying. The Confederate flag, and symbols of all things of Auschwitz, and just vile anti-Semitism, and anti-immigrant xenophobia and nationalism. Those are of a piece. To your point, Ilana. We have never, or at least, after a brief period of acknowledging the kind of transformation of our country into a true multicultural democracy that had to be done, we lost interest in that, and we're still fighting those battles. The Charlottesville, the massacre, and the Fight the Right protest, if you want to call it that, that happened there, was spurred by, Confederate monuments, the removal of Confederate monuments that were put up decades after the Civil War to reinstitute the notion of white supremacy and to alter the history of what the Civil War was about. And if we don't grapple with that, it's only going to continue to repeat itself.
And I think it speaks to some of the core motivation for the book, which is in part about memory and making sure that the significance of what happened on January 6th and really understanding the full breadth of it is not something that we forget, not something we sweep under the rug. There's been, since day one, there were attempts to whitewash it and to basically gaslight the country and make us really not acknowledge the severity of what happened on that day and what its intentions were precisely so that we don't go deep, that we don't really address the breadth of this sort of neo-fascist movement that's grown in the United States and has been, again, it's not a grassroots movement. It has been funded very heavily by a lot of billionaires out there, and to protect their interests, and also not deal with the deep bigotry and racism that is at the core of so much of it. And it's almost like we don't want to really look clearly at how deep this kind of illness has been, and as a result, we're not really effectively addressing this problem of white supremacy and economic inequality in the United States. And Trump famously said on January 6th, "Remember this day forever." And he was, of course, invoking that in a heroic sense, and you'll see how that plays in our comic book in this alternative reality. But it's really part of the objective of what we've created. We want people to remember this day forever, and the reason we called it 1/6 is so that it is evocative of other days that we remember so clearly, like 9/11, and that this should hold a place in our memory as significant as these other incredibly traumatic days in our history. Because if we forget things like this, the likelihood of them happening again is increased. And as we were saying, the insurrection never really ended. It didn't end on January 6th, and the forces that mobilized on that day were really the expression of a lot of deeper things that had been in the works for a long time, and those are still out there. And so we need to not just remember what happened, but really dig a lot deeper on where all this stuff came from and where it might lead us.
Truly, I sometimes can't believe that Trump is not still literally in the Oval Office. I'm amazed that things went down the way they did in real life. So it's very easy for me to see this and be like, yep. I also feel and understand the ability for it to happen again, because it feels so unlikely that it didn't happen that way, I guess. One of the things I noticed is that you guys are using some of the social media posts from Trump in sort of the upcoming promotional materials, but we don't really see his physical presence in this much. Was there an artistic decision around how you wanted to depict or not depict him, like his physical presence in the comic?
Yeah, it's something we've discussed a lot. And so, to your point, you don't really see him in issue 1, but his presence is very much felt. So you see the golden idyllic statue, you hear you read his voice coming from drones and loudspeakers, and there's that kind of Big Brother-esque piece. And he's much more present in upcoming issue 2, which is as we've said, set in real events. But we didn't want to make this about Trump. Nobody wants to look at more Trump images.
I know, God.
And I think more importantly for us, if Trump disappeared tomorrow, we would still be living with Trumpism and the threats of authoritarianism and bigotry and disinformation. And so, we wanted to kind of reflect that, yes, Trump was very much a catalyst for this episode and era in our nation's history. But at the end of the day, it's, authoritarianism and bigotry are much more the villains of our story than Donald J. Trump.
Which is really an interesting way to overcome a consistent challenge that I see in comics as well as most other media, where people like to tell stories with a very clear protagonist and a very clear antagonist. And in the reality is it's not individuals who are heroes, it's communities, it's organizing, it's people working together. But that also is often who we're up against systems, not just people. And even comics that we think of as like being really political and really excellent, or like something like V for Vendetta, it still has it predominantly centered on the actions of a lone hero and then another person who he passes on a legacy to, rather than, and we do see uprising, but like it's more about these individual people. And so it's interesting and it's wise, but also speaks to the challenge that you guys are doing a story where it's not just about this one boogeyman. It's about a system. It's harder to do that. It really is.
I think that's exactly right. And that's how a lot of storytelling, heroic storytelling, has really done a disservice to us out in the world as we're trying to make real change, because it is, it might feel mythic, but it's also a bit of a myth that it is just individuals who move history. And certainly all the movements for social justice in this country were, an entire generation of people who committed themselves to a particular cause and had to deal with all of the things that go with that, forming coalitions and groups and infighting, and we often don't see that story, the real need of how social change happens. We rarely see that told in popular media, and as a result, people get a wrong idea. It's all about individual heroic action. We're all a Jedi with a lightsaber doing something really dramatic, which, if in social movement circles, is like can be really
bad,
toxic behavior. Just some lone narcissist trying to grab attention. The process of social change is much deeper and much richer, and you find, I think, much more valuable things in it. And anyone who is engaged in organizing or social movement work is the feeling of community, belonging, solidarity, and really finding common cause with people who share not just your values, but values that are about protecting all humanity, protecting nature, protecting each other. That's really profound stuff. And it's very meaningful and it's very moving. And we don't see that enough in stories. And so, we hope to, exactly as you've named, trying to move it away from the narrative of lone heroes, into a place of what does it really take to protect democracy and to protect people who are more vulnerable in our society, and then make change and enact a society that actually does take care of people better. And so hopefully that is as just as compelling as the Jedi narrative, but I think there's a lot more truth in it.
Yeah, and I would add on the side of villains, I think two things. One is some of my favorite stories have villainy with nuance and villainy of systems and aspects of human behavior. So I'm going to date myself, but the original Twilight Zone, Rod Serling, my favorite episode was The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, which people who haven't seen it, where basically a town tears itself apart over prejudices and fear and scapegoating and finger pointing. And then, spoiler alert, we find that it's, aliens have just cultivated our own nature to have us defeat ourselves so that they can just walk in and, take over planet Earth without having fired a shot. And I think it's brilliant. And it's true. As Gon noted, it's, it's kind of the worst of human behavior, not a single, Darth Vader type villain that are often to blame for the worst things that happen in our society. Gon helped to create and illustrated for us when I was at the Opportunity Agenda a great short comic book called Helvetica Bold, social justice superhero. And the villain in that series was the mindset. And so he was, depicted as, kind of muscle bound, like headpiece, essentially. But, in the end, the point was that often the villain is a mindset, not an individual. And it was challenging, and continues to be challenging to depict that. But hopefully we've struck the right balance.
Very cool. The cover of the comic itself, I know you guys have some variants because it's a comic, so of course there's variant covers, but the main cover of the comic is really powerful. You see someone right off panel, but in the foreground is been hung on some gallows, and you see the hordes of people documenting this, some Trump flags flying and the Capitol dome on fire. Like, what kind of went into designing that as the opening statement that people would see to tell the story?
Well, to be honest, we drew a lot from what happened on the mall that day on January 6th. There were gallows that were constructed on the mall, life-sized gallows.
Yep.
And there were people in the crowd who were armed, and they were, writing all kinds. There was someone had scrawled "Murder the Media" on one of the doors to the Capitol, and there were chants and calls very overtly to hang Mike Pence when he refused to break the law and do what Trump was trying to intimidate him into doing, which was certify these fake electors and essentially help Trump steal the election. And then the fact that this was one of the most recorded crimes in history, and that everyone had their own cell phones recording themselves, tweeting about what they were doing constantly. And so we sort of put that absurd mixture of violence and self-aggrandizement and real, dangerous ideas together into one image to sum up, what was very close, what could have happened on January 6th. And so again, it's just a few steps away from reality, but we were drawing heavily from, news footage and photographs we saw in the media. A lot of those characters in the crowd are coming straight out of,
those images,
actual documented footage. Yeah.
It was super real. I'm just like amazed that, that you guys were like, yep, we're just going to put Mike Pence hanging on the cover. I'm like, this is badass. Have you gotten any pushback from that image from I guess it's not sold in retail yet at this moment. So.
Yeah, surprisingly, no. No one, I don't know what people are saying to each other, but no one has said to us, that this is inappropriate. And of course, the answer is, yeah, what was inappropriate was people building a gallows on the mall and calling for the vice president's death and trying to find him, from what we can tell, to actually carry that out. But we haven't gotten that. I mean, we've got some haters and, kind of right-wing, critics, which I view as a badge of honor, but that has not been one of the things and that they've singled out. And to the contrary, in terms of the comic book industry thus far, what we're hearing from comic book store owners is, that strikes the right balance. It's stark, it's startling, but it's not so graphic as to be problematic. And, we think people are going to want to pick up the book for that reason.
That's really awesome. You mentioned some of the inspirations for this comic, things like 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale. And you cite those because those are also books that we all know and recognize and that mean something to us. But what are some of the lesser known inspirations for the book that you might not put in your promotional material because people haven't heard of it, but that maybe our listeners would be interested in checking out? Movie, book, whatever it is.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can start. One of my main inspirations for this was the What If series that Marvel did as a comic book in the 70s and has since done, on Disney Plus. And actually, I would say done really well. I liked the Disney Plus series, but I have, up in my attic, What If #1, the premise of which was, what if Spider-Man had joined the Fantastic Four? And, they had Spider-Man quips something on the front cover, wait till Dr. Doom and the other baddies get a load of the Fantastic Five. That I bought that as a kid and it captured my imagination and the idea of alternate timelines. And, of course, the Watcher is the narrator. And, I just found it to be really freaky and interesting. And, it's taken, I won't say how many decades for Hollywood to catch up to the notion of the multiverse. We're just now seeing, lots and lots of films, the Doctor Strange film, and of course, Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is my favorite film of the last 12 months. So, all of that for me, in the comic book sphere has been inspirational here. Just that this is a medium where you can do that. And it's no more expensive to create a world that's different, really different from our own, than to create the actual one. And it's been really fun to be able to do that.
I was always really intrigued by alternate reality stories since I was a kid. And one that I love, that was one of the first mainstream comics I read as a kid, was the Days of Future Past series from the X-Men, which they made into a very forgettable movie. I actually remember the comic, where your character Wolverine and Kitty Pryde are, thrust into an alternate future. I think Professor X is already dead, and they have to basically defend themselves against all these sort of authoritarian, nightmarish threats. But really, the story is about, if you could go back in time and change things, what would you do? And I think that's so much at the core of so many multiverse stories, is about choice. And going back to that moment where we made a choice where, reality took a different path and a different timeline was created. And we're really getting to the heart of that by telling a sort of political multiverse story, in that we are faced with a really profound choice as to where we want to go as a society and as a country. Are we going to give in to sort of these neo-fascist ideas that have destroyed so many societies, in fact? Or are we going to fight for our democratic values and fight to protect everyone in our society? And I think, the multiverse in our story presents us with that clear choice, not just on what happened on January 6th, but of course, like all great dystopian stories, it's a power of painting this dystopian reality to sound the alarm bell and make us very vigilant on the reality that could happen and how we must work to avoid it. And so seeing the future, all these great science fiction stories, and deciding which one we want, I think is a great science fiction trope, but it's also at the core of, I think, what we need to do as a country right now.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Remind our listeners where they can pick up the comic, and also where they can keep up with both of your work online.
The comic book is available in digital form on Amazon right now for Kindle, and on Issue, ISSUU, for everyone else. It will be available early March in print, definitely from Amazon, and in hopefully in a comic book store near you. And so I hope that your listeners will go to a comic book store near them and say, hey, I hear this amazing book is coming, and can you order it? We're trying to pierce the Diamond comic book distributor infrastructure and get distributed that way, but demand is really going to help. Also, please, I hope your listeners will go to 16comics.com. So it's ONESIX comics.com. You can, there are links to buy the book, but also to get our education and action guide when that's available, and just to sign up for more information. I'm on Twitter as Opportunity One. All my Instagram posts are about gardening, so I don't know how interested your listeners will be about that. But we also are at 16 Comics on Twitter and Instagram.
Awesome. And what about you, Gon?
I try and stay off the socials for my mental health, but you can actually find me at another project I'm doing, the climateclock.world. Climateclock.world. Don't forget the world. And you can see some of the work that I'm doing on climate change. But certainly feel free to sign up on our website, 16comics.com, and reach out. We'd love to hear what people feel about this comic, and engage in a deeper conversation with you about what we all can do about this together.
Well, thank you both for joining us. This has really been a pleasure. And like I said, I'm just so excited that it's so good. And I'm really excited for reading what's next. As for me, this is Graphic Policy Radio. We're on every podcast platform. I am on Twitter, a little bit too much, ELANA_Brooklyn. And as things move and change, that continues to be my handle wherever I'm going, strictly so that you guys can find me. We have more graphic policy coming up for you soon, including another episode of our Deep Space Dive DS9 spinoff podcast. And Yes, as we like to say, keep it geeky.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.